So now using the tracing paper, I'm going to trace out the skirt pattern. So I'm going to use my hip ruler to get that pattern line there. I'm going to put my weights there so I don't get a lot of slipping going on. Okay. And again, just as you are going to have for your front and back bodice, for your skirt slopers, I've also included half scale PDFs for you to practice on. So again, you can do what I did and lightly trace them out. And then using the notes information, you can just do these at a half scale, just so you can get familiar with the lines and the marking. And once you really have a concept of that, then you can sort of like move on to the larger scale where you're adding in actual measurements, because that's when things get tricky, when you're adding in the measurements. It's easy to copy what you see directly when you don't have to rely on actually having accurate measurements, but then you'll see when you're ready to move it to a working pattern that if nothing matches up, that can be very frustrating. So you want to just first get comfortable with the process of creating the patterns and what they should look like, and then that'll definitely help you as far as getting comfortable with creating them from scratch, just using the measurements, because you also, like I said, have to really become familiar with measurements and really being able to quickly assess what 5/8 is, a quarter. You have to be able to do that in 1/8 very quickly, because, or efficiently, I should say, because that's going to definitely affect. Some of these patterns need to be altered by a quarter, an 1/8, and sometimes even if you're off by just those tiny measurements, it can really throw off the whole thing. Okay, so now I just have the outline of the skirt. And again, it's a fairly simple silhouette because I'm keeping pretty much everything, except I'm gonna take off a large portion of the skirt, because as you'll see soon, I'm just gonna go over briefly how I created the bottom portion of the skirt. So I'm not gonna actually walk you through all the measurements. I'm gonna give you the measurements that I used for the skirt in your notes. I just want you to see what it looks like to create that circle pattern. So from the waist, I'm gonna measure down about 14 inches. And I'm measuring that because that is going to be the length. I'm just gonna use this as a marker. It seems really short, but because the top portion of the dress is gonna come down fairly high, I'm actually gonna move it down a little bit because that hip line definitely tells you that seems pretty short. So I'm gonna say 15, and then I'm gonna give myself about an inch seam allowance just in case that's still off too. Okay, so it's gonna be, we're gonna shorten that length. So this was the old hem. So you guys can see it. That was the old hemline. So that was going much further down. This is gonna be the new hemline because this is where I'm gonna be attaching my bottom portion of my gown, because we are making a gown. So we don't need it to go down quite that far because that's not the look we're going for. I'm also gonna give myself an inch seam allowance, and this is just in case the hemline is too short. I can break it up to just having a little bit more flexibility. So I'm gonna end up, I didn't slash them, but this is just to indicate this is gonna be cut. Okay, So I have my darts here, I have my hip line. The hip line is important because you also always want to make sure that you're in alignment. Anytime you're doing your designs, these lines are key indicators in what you're going to use in your muslin as well, because you want to make sure that you're lining everything up. If this is slanted in any way when it's on the form or the body, that means you are not in alignment with the garment, and it's going to show in the way the garment falls. So these are markers to let me know in which direction I'm going to be folding. This is a center front line to let me know this will be cut on the fold. It won't be cut separately. And I'm also going to indicate that. Cut on fold. And here we're going to cut one lining, one main. We don't need interfacing for this bottom portion of the dress, and you'll see why, because interfacing is really for structure, and when you have the top portion, especially sweetheart strapless, you're definitely going to need a lot of structure, whereas you don't need that same structure with a bottom portion. I'm also going to add my 5/8 seam allowance because I added it on my bodice front and back. So I just want to make sure that I keep that going. In any place that you find that you don't need it anymore, or it's too much, it's like I said, it's a lot easier to cut something off than it is to add it back on, especially once you cut on the fabric. Here I don't need to add any seam allowance because I'm cutting on the fold. And also here at the hip area, I'm also going to pivot it just a little bit because I want to have just a little bit. I know we cover different silhouettes. This is going to have a very trumpet-esque silhouette. So it's not going to be mermaid, meaning it would have to be a lot longer and be a lot tighter. So this is just going to, right at the hip area, I'm going to go in about 1 inch and then just create this secondary hip line. And I'm going to do the same thing at the front. And this is actually going to be my new seam allowance because I want to follow this line, so we can get rid of that because this is the line that I'm actually going to be using. And get rid of that. And then just write seam allowance in here. And then we go ahead and we cut. And then we do the same thing to the back area. Again, because I'm doing the same thing to the front and back, I'm not going to go through it. You're going to do essentially the same thing. You're going to add the seam allowance all around. You're going to cut down to that same length. You're also going to add a bit of that curve to the side seam. You also should introduce your notches. That way you know what's the side seam and also what you know the front and the back is. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.